I have to make a quick point real quick because I just made a video explaining how the 14th Amendment protects babies from infanticide. I wasn't discussing the unborn babies still in the womb. I was discussing babies who had been born, who perhaps the parent had intended to have aborted. The abortion failed for whatever reason. The child was then born, and you have people like Ralph Northam and others within the Democratic Party who are still okay with ending the life of that child. And I had to. I want to briefly make a few points that I view as ironic, and I also want to oversimplify a complicated era in our history, i.e. the Civil War, and anybody who's ever studied the Civil War to any degree, aside from what you hear, because you get people who simplify it very much down to, it was states' rights. Then you have people who simplify it very much down to slavery. It absolutely was about slavery. To hide behind states' rights is ridiculous. States' right to do what? Was it the states' rights to coin money? Was it the states' rights to... No, it was the states' rights to have slaves. So, anybody who studied the period, not necessarily just the Civil War, but all the decades leading up to the Civil War, and people love to quote people like Abraham Lincoln and everything who had looser stances on slavery and whatnot, and use that, to kind of beat them over the head. I think it's very ironic what's going on within the Democratic Party in regards to abortion today, or maybe infanticide, and what the Democratic Party was going 250 years ago when it came to slavery. I'm not anti-Democrat. I think the Democratic Party did a lot of good, actually, in the 20th century when it comes to the workers' rights and things like that. However, that party is hijacked. I don't think the Democratic Party today is capable of anything good. And I'm not even talking about today as in like modern. I'm talking like even 15 years ago, they weren't as far gone as they are right now. The period leading up to the Civil War, it was very clear that we had this issue. It was a very tricky issue, okay? Abortion is a very, very tricky issue. It's not simple, okay? I'm much more closer to pro-life than pro-choice. I don't really like those labels. I don't believe it's possible to ban all abortions. I don't think it's possible, and I'm not going to explain why. Slavery also, if you go back, it was a very, very tricky issue. You're not going to end this institution without completely transforming the economy of the whole country. Not just the South, but the North also, which was relying on, was heavy into textiles and all that, was relying on the Southern economy. So this is a war that was going to completely transform the economy of the United States. It was not a simple issue. You had new states being admitted into the Union. You had Democrats who were pro-union. They did not want to leave they didn't want to leave the Union, but they wanted to allow Southern states to have slaves. You had all kinds of different opinions. You had free soilers at the beginning of the Civil War. The abolitionists were actually they were arguably fairly radical. They were not the majority by any means. Were they the majority at the time? And what the Civil War did, what the decades with all these, we've heard of all these famous Supreme Court cases and all the attempts that were made to pacify both sides for as long as possible. It all came to a head with the Civil War. And it's very, very ironic that the Democratic Party is being exposed right now. And I'm going to explain why. But it's very, very ironic because now the Democratic Party and people like Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren, they're now voting against something that anybody with a heart at all would endorse, whether it's for partisan reasons or whatever. This bill that was just in the U.S. Senate to protect babies who were born. Whether or not the mother intended to abort the baby or not is irrelevant. I find it ironic that the 14th Amendment, which was passed after the Civil War to address one of the problems that came out of this war, which was, what do we do with all these freed slaves? How do we give them access to citizenship? The 14th Amendment dealt with that. You had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which we consider the Civil War amendments, and the 14th Amendment was passed in order to give them citizenship. The 14th Amendment, as I explained in my previous video, clearly protects anybody who is born in the United States. Okay? It protects people who aren't U.S. citizens. All right? It's not even just about protecting U.S. citizens, although if you are born in the United States, you are a U.S. citizen. You're granted privileges and immunities even if you're a foreign national. Okay? Some things are human rights, and the Constitution doesn't mention human rights. It clearly there is an understanding within the minds of the framers that there is such a thing as human rights. That was a 20th century term. They would have said something more along the lines of natural rights. I find it very ironic that the 14th Amendment is going to be the roadblock that stops this lunacy. These people like Ralph Northam. Did Ralph Northam ever consider the fact that the 14th Amendment, like the Constitution, clearly prohibits him from doing what he thinks he can allow in his state? You can allow a baby to be born, regardless of whether the baby was supposed to be aborted or not. Completely regardless of that fact, the 14th Amendment prohibits you from murdering a child once it's been born. Once it has been born, it is completely protected by the United States Constitution. That is just plain as day. Okay? And it's ironic that 150 years later, you have this issue of abortion, which for decades has been this contentious issue, and now it is being exposed exactly for what it is, because it's the Democrats themselves are no longer taking a moderate position. I will say, regardless of what your opinions are, I do believe you can have a moderate opinion and be okay with some abortions. I'm not saying whether I agree with it or not. That's not what I'm saying. But you can not be a nut job and have this radical opinion of abortion up to 9 months, and believing that an infanticide can be justified. That's completely prohibited, and I find it. Now I'm ranting hard, but it is completely ironic that the Democratic Party that was exposed in the 1860s, and it was decades long, this contentious issue was brought to a head, and it became clear to me by about 1863. From my estimation, I am an amateur historian. That is when it became apparent. All right, many people just wanted to preserve the Union. There were many different stances, but it was apparent by 1863 that the only way you can preserve this Union is to get rid of this cancer of slavery. That was how you preserve this Union. And the abortion issue has become much more important to me than it used to be. And I think it's happened with a lot of people. I don't know much about polls. I tend to not give them too much attention because I don't really understand how they work too much. And also, all the polls that were, promoting Hillary Clinton as the winner were complete nonsense. They were complete lies and nonsense. And so I don't know much about polling, so I typically don't give them much attention. But it appears that the polling data is suggesting that in recent months, there are more and more people are identifying as pro-life. And it's obvious to me why. It's because of this far left stance taken by the Democrats. Nothing moderate about their opinion. Nothing moderate about it. It's completely ironic that this contentious issue of slavery was brought to a head and exposed the Democratic Party for what they were, and they lost on moral grounds. They did lose on moral grounds, and morality was a huge component of that war. The same thing is happening here today. Now, there isn't military conflict in the streets, which I hope we never have to see. It is possible, by the way, for other reasons, but hopefully that never happens. It's ironic. The Democratic Party is being exposed. How can you be in favor of infanticide? That's banned. What are you? You gotta be either not thinking for yourself, or you gotta be a pretty cruel person to be in the Democratic Party and and just be going along with it because that's what the herd's doing. Because 10 years ago, none of these people would be okay with that. There's no way, but they are now because they're going with whatever direction the wind blows. I digress.